In the School of Public Health.
Okay, before you use up all my time.
Thank you very much for being.
I have a mic here, so I'm good.
Good.
Can put that away. Oh, I've got to turn it off.
The one you have.
I turned mine on.
Take it off from it. Yes, you're okay.
I'm good. Great. Thank you very much, Anka. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be with you here today, and particularly to see so many friends. I was going to say old friends, but so many friends from a long time ago, and friends from not so long ago, and friends who've made a journey across the island to come in and be with me here from the Pop Council. Thanks very much, Jim and Bob. To Michelle from Albert Einstein. I sort of make sure I have a few of my groupies with me at my talks. But my association with the HIV Center is about 30-odd years old. And I remember when I came to Columbia University, one of the things I used to really enjoy while I was doing my master's in 1987 and 88, when you think back, 87, that's 32 years ago, was coming to the HIV Center talks on a Thursday morning, just as it is now. Partly it was because they provided muffins and tea, and partly because they had these great talks. And I got to meet, some lifelong friends at the time, including Ron Bayer, Mervyn and Zena, and Anka, and so on. So it's been an incredible journey, and I know so many of the folks in the HIV Center. And to think the HIV Center is 32 years on and going strong. I thought what I would do is do a bit of a sentimental journey and just give you a sense of how two young students who just finished their masters here at Columbia were trying to figure out what to do about HIV. And to just walk you through a bit of history and how Quresh and I were sort of thinking about the HIV epidemic and what we were doing over time. So I think most of you know these figures from UNAIDS, so I won't go through that. But I'll come back to this in my last slide. But the number that is the reason why 30 years later I'm still doing work on HIV is this number. That today we have globally 5,000 new infections occurring every day. That number, it just spins in my mind when I think about it. And that we cannot stand by idly and let that carry on day after day after day. We've got to do something about it. And when we think about what's a major component of that 5,000, then it's a reminder to all of us that Africa has about 70% of all the HIV in the world. And about 3,500 of that 5,000 is from Africa. Actually, slightly less than 3,500 because of Russia and the Ukraine have growing incidence rates. So you're looking at somewhere between 3,000 and 3,500 cases, new cases of HIV every day in Africa. And that when we look at our amazing accomplishments in this field, and that has principally been our ability to increase antiretroviral therapy rollout, something that we're all very proud of being part of, and Columbia University through ICAP has played a major role in that, and many of you have played a role in that. You can see that we are increasing by about 2 million each year, principally driven by the Global Fund PEPFAR and Unitaid, that we have been increasing the number of people on antiretroviral therapy. But when we look at the number of new cases, it's a very disappointing story. So the HIV epidemic reached its peak in the late 1990s. And by the time we all went to the Durban conference in 2000 to lament and fight against the drug companies and the high prices of drugs and the lack of access to ART, the HIV epidemic was already on its way down. And we have seen a steady decline in the number of new cases every year until about 5 or 6 years ago. In the last 5 to 6 years, we have seen pretty much a flatlining of the number of new cases occurring at a global level, somewhere between about 1.7 million and about 2 million. Roughly about that number every year we've seen. And that's really worrying. So when we met at UNAIDS about 6-7 years ago, and we had our consultation about what should we project and what should we aim for, we were talking at that time that we would set a target of 500,000 new cases in 2020. So we got 2 years to get there. And that's what we projected based on the natural decline in the number of new cases. Instead, we were just not ready to see this, because we thought we're rolling out treatment. Treatment is effective prevention. We should do better than we've been doing in the past. Well, not so. Simply not so. So why? Is it that treatment just doesn't work? Putting 2 million people every year doesn't lead to fewer infections? Well, the answer to that partially comes from this next slide. That when you look in Africa at the highest incidence rates, they occur in young girls. And when you look at the prevalence of HIV infection in pregnant women in South Africa, and I'm using here the Department of Health's annual survey, you can see that in the 15 to 19-year-olds, the prevalence pretty much hasn't changed in this time. And prevalence in young girls can be interpreted pretty closely to the incidence rate. So when we start looking at the prevalence rates in the 15 to 24-year-olds, prevalence rates in the very young girls, we really are seeing almost no progress. And that's been the problem. That young girls bear the brunt of the HIV infection in Africa. And I'm telling most of you this when you already know this, but that it hasn't been getting any better. So while the whole world has been benefiting from the steady decline, we haven't seen the benefits in young girls. So that brings me back to why we started doing research in this field about 30 years ago. When we left South Africa, Croatia and I, there was no HIV in South Africa. In fact, when I studied medicine, HIV wasn't even on the curriculum. In fact, I don't know why I wasted my time going to medical school. I went for 6 years, and they didn't tell me anything about HIV, and the only thing I do now is HIV. So I could have skipped those 6 years. Actually, when I teach the medical students, I remind them about the importance of medicine being foundational, that it makes you a good lifelong learner. So when we came to New York, we were overwhelmed. I mean, Croatia and I would say, oh, what's going on here? You couldn't walk anywhere in Columbia University or its precinct without seeing something about HIV. So we, coming from Africa to New York, are just overwhelmed. And we went to a talk in the medical school auditorium, which I see is being renovated at the moment, by a person called Samuel Broder. So Sam Broder was at the NCI, I mean, you guys are showing your age if you don't nod that you know Sam Broder, right? So Sam was from NCI, and he did the first ever study of an antiretroviral drug against HIV, a drug called AZT. And he was describing his trial. And he was telling us how the gay men that were coming in for the trial, when they walked out, they were taking all their tablets and they were pooling them, and then they were redividing them. And that was the problem in doing that first AZT trial, that they didn't want to go onto placebo. Anyway, as we know from history, the trial showed an amazing survival benefit. And even if the doctors refused to acknowledge it, the patients all knew it, that some of them were doing amazingly, and the others were continuing to deteriorate. And they could see this occurring in front of their eyes. And they decided the best thing to do was to cheat the system, and so just take half the drug. And of course, as you know, that trial was done with pretty toxic levels of AZT. So taking half the amount of AZT was actually pretty good for them, as it turned out. So when Quraish and I were leaving the US, leaving New York to go back to South Africa, Zina, of course, indoctrinated us completely, not to mention Anka's role as well in indoctrinating us, saying, no, you need to go and do something about HIV. So when we got back to South Africa, we said, okay, where do we start? And we said, well, there's pretty much no community-based study of HIV. And the reason was pretty simple, because there wasn't much HIV. And we were just not seeing cases of HIV, other than in hemophiliacs and in a few gay men. So that led Quraish to do this study. It was a study where she went house to house in the malaria zones of northern KwaZulu-Natal, where anyway they go and take a blood from one person randomly from every household every 6 weeks. They just do this. It's malaria surveillance. And we just took a bit of that blood and we tested it for HIV. And out of that came these data. And when we first saw this data, we thought something's wrong, that there's something interacting with the test or something in young girls. Because when you look at it, the blue line shows you the prevalence in the young boys. Young boys, teenage boys, have almost no HIV, very little. But if you look at the girls, they were already at their peak prevalence, or close to their peak prevalence. And that struck us. And that became the basis of our research for the next 30 years. And this study we did when we left Columbia University at the end of 1988. This study was done in 1989 and 1990. Paper was published in about 91, 92, somewhere there. Of course, now we know, when you look at more recent data from several countries, Kenya, Cameroon, Malawi, the red line goes up earlier and faster and higher in most instances than the blue line. If you look at this diagram today, the most recent national survey undertaken by the HSRC, it looks almost the same. There are only two changes. The y-axis, here it's 2%, 4%, and 6%. If they do these studies now, it's like 20%, 40%, 60%, right? It's the scale of it has grown. And the red line is now much higher than the blue line. So we have just seen the challenge of HIV in young women grow. And when we look at it across the board, this is data from UNAIDS, country after country, the prevalence in young women is much, much higher than the prevalence in young men. So this was really the driving force, and why back in 1989, Quraish and I decided to focus on young girls, something that we continue to this day. So we said, well, what do we do about the young girls? So the first thing we decided, okay, let's just see in these young boys and girls, how are they doing in terms of condoms? Condoms was at least something we knew worked. Let's just establish. And when we did the study in high school students, we realized, actually, condoms are non-event here. Nobody even talks about it. And the only value it has were young boys using it to show other boys that they were sexually active when they weren't. But that was pretty much the only value condoms had among high school students. So what we did is we said, well, let's look at how can we improve the availability of condoms. So Croatia trained 4 young people, 2 boys and 2 girls, in how to collect qualitative information. We gave them just 2 questions, and we selected randomly clinics that they had to go to. And they had to go to these clinics at different times and on different days. So we had 4 sets of data on each clinic. And all 4 of them, looked pretty young. They were in their late teens, early 20s. And we asked them to ask the question, can I get some condoms? And if no information about the condoms was forthcoming, they had to ask the nurse or whoever was giving them the condoms, can you explain how to use it? So that's only 2 questions we trained them to. We know nothing about qualitative methods. We just trained them to be simulated patients, and we told them to go in and just ask for condoms. And at the end of each clinic visit, they came out and they wrote detailed notes about their whole experience, how they felt, how they were treated, and so on. We did that study, and we were just amazed. The results were so shocking to us, because pretty much almost every clinic they went to, when the girls asked for condoms, the nurses did everything in their power to dissuade them from taking the condoms. Right? Because from the nurses' perspective, these girls were choosing a bad contraceptive. That's what, from the nurses' point of view, that's what they were doing. And so they had to be convinced to take another form of contraception. So we said we can't publish this without sharing this with the nurses. So we asked the head of the city health department at their monthly meeting, can we present these results? So we did that to all the nurses. It's about nearly 1,000 nurses working in the clinics. When we presented the results, they said, but you didn't get our side of the story. And that's true, actually. We just got the students' perspective, the young people's perspective. So we said, okay, we're coming to interview you, and we'll choose randomly again, and we'll just come and do these interviews and find out from you your experiences and so on. And so that led us to write 2 papers. The first was the user's experience, and then the provider's experience. And we actually were told to do this by the nurses because they felt they were not being heard. Actually, what was striking was one of the things we asked the nurses about, how do they talk to their own teen children about condoms and about contraception. And we learned actually none of them had. Right? The tradition was you send your children to an aunt. They call them aunt, but basically it's a woman in the community, and you hope she tells them what they need to know. Anyway, so the first thing we learned was condoms were not a pretty useful way right now of preventing HIV. So we said, well, who can we get to promote condoms? Because the nurses were not doing a good job. We know that many people who are ill or who are looking for help will go to traditional healers. Maybe they have a better approach. So we did some studies, and we went and interviewed traditional healers to find out their perspectives and so on. Anyway, I won't go through that. That's another story for another day because it's too long a story. So we were becoming clearer in our minds that simply trying to promote condoms was not going to give us good enough approach to controlling HIV in young girls. So we said, let's go and study the highest incidence women. And really it was in order for us to get some idea, in doing small studies, get some idea of the risk factors and begin asking some basic biological questions. So now we're sort of moving beyond just trying to promote condoms, but we wanted to understand why these young girls were getting so much of HIV. And so Quraish and I took this drive to the truck stop in the Midlands, where Martin Zondi, a local health officer, had been doing work with the sex workers at the truck stops. And the Midlands, in that area in Ladysmith, there's like about 8, 9, 10 truck stops, because all the trucks, it's halfway between Johannesburg and Durban. So they stop there overnight and they have sex. And then they drive on to Durban, and the same in reverse. And so we tried to understand what was driving the risk in these sex workers. So we studied anal sex, we studied vaginal insertions. We were looking at everything that we could to understand the nexus between behavior and biology in these sex workers. But one of the things that struck us as we were doing these studies was the importance of these mobile men, these truck drivers and migration and so on. So Mark Lurie, who was a young student who just finished his master's, who came and joined us with his wife Abigail Harrison, they had a particular interest in this. So we worked with them, and we began to start asking a whole series of questions about migrant labor and the way in which migrant labor was contributing to conjugal instability. It was creating the town wife, which was the sex worker. They're not really sex workers. The town wife is a better description, but it's a shared town wife between a few people. And then their married wives in the rural areas where the children were kept. And this was really under apartheid. This kind of system was what was created, and it created the basis for the spread of HIV. But in about 1996, after discussions we had with King Holmes, and King was very influential in helping us think about the biology of risk and the role of other STDs, we initiated a large clinical trial where half the clinics in a rural community called Slabisa were randomized to improve STD treatment. When we used syndrome packets, and the syndrome packets idea was actually King's idea. It was a one-stop shop so that nurses don't forget to do the 4 things that were required, the 4 C's. I can't remember what the 4 C's are these days, but counseling was one of them and so on. So compliance was another. So in treating patients with STDs, we showed in this trial that we can increase the quality of care for STDs pretty well, but we had no impact on HIV. And this was very disappointing, because just about a year before our results from RACI came out showing that STD treatment made a difference. And of course, we now know today 7 other trials all failed to show an effect. Only the RACI study showed a benefit. And we don't even understand, not RACI, sorry, I'm making a mistake, it's Mwanza. The Mwanza study showed a benefit. And the RACI trial, which came out just after our trial, showed no benefit of mass treatment. So we now know that if you're going to treat STDs, you should treat STDs anyway because you want to treat STDs. But to benefit HIV, it's questionable whether it will have any impact. So far we've studied condoms, we've studied behavior, we've studied biology, we've studied migration, we've studied STD treatment, and we weren't making any headway. But in the midst of all of that, we get President Mbeki coming to power. And so he detracts us. Now, instead of doing research, we are busy challenging the president. President created a panel and so on. So we've really had that battle. And not to be outdone, the Minister of Health was a sycophant of the President and followed his denialist views. And based on that, refused to roll out nevirapine, even though the HPT, the IVNET 012 trial results showed a benefit. So we decided to challenge her. The Treatment Action Campaign took her to court, and it went up to the highest court, our constitutional court, where it was heard, and Croatia was the principal person to give the evidence. Hers was the lead evidence in the trial. And in preparing for what she had to say, we were gathering all of the evidence because we had to provide a strong scientific case. And it sort of reminds me a bit about climate change and Trump. You sort of, the evidence is glaring, but you choose not to heed it. So given that we did all this hard work, we wrote a piece, and I gathered together about 30 of our country's leading pediatricians and gynecologists, obstetricians, to co-sign this letter that Croatia and article that Croatia and I wrote, and we published it in the Lancet, basically making the scientific case for rolling out nevirapine. And I guess you all know the outcome of that case was the court told the government to provide nevirapine, and it was good that this evidence featured as part of that. But it was becoming more and more clear to us as treatment was becoming available that stigma and discrimination and racial stereotyping of the HIV epidemic in South Africa, in a country just coming out of apartheid, that we needed to tackle this head on. And so we were busy writing articles about looking at stigma, looking at discrimination, looking at the racial issues of how people were looking at the HIV epidemic. And we ratcheted this up all the way through to a piece in Nature, just sort of outlining the complexity of stigma and discrimination, how it was impacting the HIV epidemic in South Africa. So let me come now to the one piece in all of this that I didn't talk about. And that was that while we were doing all of these studies, based on that original study that Croatia did back in 1989, and based on an editorial that Zena published in the American Journal of Public Health about the importance of methods that women could use, we decided to take up this issue. And we decided that we were going to try and develop some kind of technology that would empower young girls to protect themselves. And at that time, the drug that was widely available and being punted was a drug called nonoxynol 9. It was already widely used in condoms. Condoms were being coated with nonoxynol 9 as a spermicide. Nonoxynol 9 as a gel was already being used together with diaphragms. So it is a widely used agent. And it made sense that given its mechanism of action and the fact that it kills HIV pretty well in the test tube, that we should study it. So Croatia and I decided, let's tackle this problem and work with nonoxynol 9. In parallel, there was a person in Kenya called Joan Kreis, who was also working on nonoxynol 9. But she was working with a very high dose in a sponge. So we thought, let's try a film. And just about this time, a company started making Listerine. I don't know if you've seen these. It comes in a little plastic container, and it's a film that you put onto your tongue, and it dissolves and clears your mouth. And when we saw that, that was part of the impetus for us to actually develop this film. So we worked actually with a US company to make this film for us, and to make a placebo for us. And we did that study, and one of our students, Roxana Rastamji, who subsequently came to Columbia University, did her PhD in epi, and now works for the NIH. She crossed to the other side, sadly for us. Actually, we're very happy. I saw her earlier this week at the NIH. She did the study with Qureisha and I, looking at naloxone 9 film. And actually, we saw something that took us a bit aback, which was in HIV-positive people, their vaginal viral load went up. And we didn't think much of it at the time. We reported it, but we didn't think that that was a big deal at the time. And we were working, while we were doing that study, WHO learned that we were doing this work on naloxone 9, and they were working with a company called Columbia Laboratories to make a gel with naloxone 9. And so they approached us to participate in the study, the Call 1492 study. And we did that study, which was reported at the AIDS 2000 conference, its negative results. In fact, naloxone 9, as it turned out, was not just inert, it actually enhanced the transmission of HIV. So now we were not going on a flat line, we were going backwards in our quest to try and find some kind of technology for women. So we then proceeded to studying a slew of other drugs. And we were working with a range of other players, and we had joined the international network that had access to these products, called it was called HIVNet to start with, and then became the HPTN. And we were doing these studies to look at the safety, look at the efficacy of these drugs. And eventually the one that went all the way through to a phase 3 trial was called Pro 2000. Another one called Buffer Gel. So we did all of those studies, but basically we had spent 18 years developing and testing all of these topical agents. Every one of them a major failure. And you know, in our field, you don't fail quietly in a little office somewhere where you see the negative result, right? These are all done in the public eye with government money, and everybody wants to know the results. So when you fail, it's like fanfare. You failed. So I think we became known as the experts in failure. And we had failed 8 times in succession. So some have asked me, you know, by the time you fail the 4th or 5th time, didn't you say enough is enough? And it's true, enough was enough. And Qureisha and I just kept saying, well, the problem's still there. If the problem's still there, we still got to try and find a solution to the problem. And so we just kept at it. But in 2003, we had this idea about using an antiretroviral drug, a new drug that just became available. It wasn't even licensed then, and called tenofovir. And so we did the tenofovir gel study, which you all know, which showed 7 years later, in 2010, we presented at the Vienna AIDS conference that it was effective in preventing HIV. And of course, for us, the thing about it was that the news until this time had just been bad, bad, bad. Everybody was despondent. The field was in its doldrums. So our result, which is actually quite a poor result, 39% protection today, nobody would take that seriously. But it was the first positive result. And so that's what enthused the field. And Uncle, you were there when we presented these results. And, I mean, the whole field was galvanized by these positive results. And Science, as you know, produces each year its list of the top 10 scientific breakthroughs of the year. Medical breakthroughs don't make it very often. But in 2010, we were among the top 10 scientific breakthroughs at that time. And shortly after that, several trials were releasing results of PrEP over the next few years. And so we published this editorial about, you know, a defining moment, that the evidence is there. We've got to start doing this now. And part of this was to get the whole idea of antiretroviral prophylaxis into programs. And so when we think back to 2003, when we had the idea, and proceeding with the trials, and when we showed the results in 2010, and all of the consultations and all of the supportive trials, and our trial was just the first. There were many better trials and much more important trials that were done. And all of that came together when we sat at the WHO in 2015, collating all of this evidence in the meta-analysis that showed quite compellingly that antiretroviral prophylaxis works. And basically the way we phrased it was tenofovir-containing antiretroviral prophylaxis. It didn't matter whether it's gel, whether it's tenofovir on its own or with emtricitabine, doesn't matter. Tenofovir on its own works, in combination works well, it's all good. And that's what led to the guideline being released in 2015. And then coming full circle, our government last year made it official policy that all sex workers in South Africa should be offered antiretroviral prophylaxis, and then earlier this year that all people at high risk should be offered antiretroviral prophylaxis with Truvada. So it's come full circle. When you think about how we started with the first study, studying the sex workers, and now coming all the way around that we now have a technology that they can use, and they can use it to control their risk of HIV. The problem is that you have to know you're at risk, and you have to adhere to the medication, and that's been part of the challenge. So in 2012, one of the women from our tenofovir gel trial, so I'm going to talk a bit now over the next few years about the tenofovir gel trial and how it's helped us move on beyond just the gel. We discovered, so in 2010, while we were talking about tenofovir gel and antiretroviral prophylaxis, two groups in the US, at Scripps and at the Vaccine Research Center, described individuals with broadly neutralizing antibodies. Now, until then, we'd sort of heard, we'd known about broadly neutralizing antibodies. There were 3 others that had been made, but they weren't very good, and they weren't good enough in terms of potency. But these 2 new antibodies were amazing. And the 2 groups had used a similar technology to identify them. And using the pseudovirion assay, we could find patients who had broadly neutralizing antibodies. And it happened that Lynn Morris, on a Fogarty Fellowship, went to work with Bart Haynes and brought this technology back. So we were among the first to get this technology, the ability to do these assays. And of course, we looked at the seroconverters from the tenofovir gel trial, and we found women who had broadly neutralizing antibody. Now, the Scripps group and the VRC, they screened thousands of people to find these broadly neutralizing antibodies. They had no idea how they were created because they don't have the longitudinal data. But because these women were in the gel trial, as soon as they got infected, we studied them in great detail. We were bleeding them every week, right, for the first 3 months, and then monthly thereafter until we started doing them 3 monthly. So we have detailed information on these women. And we know exactly how their virus mutated pretty much week to week. And we watched how their immune response adapted to the changing virus. And so we were the first to describe how broadly neutralizing antibodies are created. And basically we showed that in this patient, this is Lynn and Penny, who did this in our humoral immunology lab, from a strain-specific antibody, 1 shift in a glycan, from position 332 to 334, amazing. Just that 1 shift that occurs that leads to an epitope that is conserved across viruses and leads to this woman creating a broadly neutralizing antibody. So now that we saw how broadly neutralizing antibodies are created, we decided to screen a whole lot of people, and we found this woman, Caprisa 256. Caprisa 256 had a very unusual antibody, and we knew this when we first saw the results on the pseudovirion assay. We said there's something unusual about her. And we went on to study her in more detail, and then we tested her serum against a panel of 200 viruses from across the world. And we found that she does amazingly well in killing HIV. Her antibody had the ability to kill HIV like we'd never seen in any of the other antibodies we'd worked with. So we had to figure out what to do with this. And one of the reasons that we established that she is able to, her antibody is able to do this, is that HIV has this glycan covering, right? It's got this sugar coating. It's a bit like an M&M, right? It's got this sugar on the outside, so you can't get to the chocolate. So the problem was that antibodies weren't able to kill HIV because all they were doing was going, when they get to the HIV, when they get to the GP 120 and GP41 on the little mushroom on the outside of the virus, it can't get through. And the sugars were holding them back. Caprisa 256 solved that problem because she had two long CDRH3 regions, two long protein-like arms that simply just went through the gap. They just went between the sugar and went straight down onto the virus, reached the peptides on the virus, and were able to kill HIV. We now know that Caprisa 256 is the most potent of all the broadly neutralizing antibodies there, and there are about 24 or so that have been described. In 2014, we showed the importance of genital inflammation in acquisition amongst young women, and I'll come back to that, but basically, again, from the tenofovir gel trial, in red, in this heat map, is those women who have raised cytokines. Green is normal or low cytokines, and basically the blue squares reflect women who subsequently got HIV. Yellow squares, women who remained uninfected. So if you had raised cytokines, you had a pretty high chance of acquiring HIV. If you have low normal cytokines, your chance of getting HIV is much less. So we began to see the importance of inflammation, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then we showed in this paper in EJM that tenofovir gel not only prevented HIV, it's also highly effective against HSV2. In fact, it's better against HSV2. And there's no other prevention for HSV2, right? This is the only prevention we have now. Condoms are pretty much it that we promote for HSV2 prevention. But condoms don't work because HSV2 is not in the semen, right? It's just shed all over in the vulva. So we know that condoms don't work pretty well for HSV2. So we finally found a technology that prevents HSV2. In 2016, Aisha, one of our senior researchers, decided that she was going to do this big study, and she was doing this with the CDC. And it's a random sample from the community, just over 10,000 people. And so we can look at it in narrow age bands because we have the sample size. And when we saw these data, it took us even aback. Right? So this comes from 2016. And if you look at the prevalence of HIV in women, by age 15, 16, it's 6%. By age 27, 28, it's nearly 50%. When you start talking about women in their young 30s, 70.2%. I mean, just the thought of that there are more people who need treatment than not on treatment, right? That's what the burden of HIV is in this community. And you can see the boys have this lag, but they start catching up towards the end. So these data, we've been thinking about what to do, and we've been trying to find new ideas. But one of the things we did is we sequenced the viruses. And in sequencing the viruses, we are able to establish who in the community has a similar virus to the others. In other words, we can identify clusters, people with the same or similar virus. Using these clusters, we are able to work out, together with some assumptions, the transmission pattern. And so we showed this and we presented this in the 2016 conference. In essence, the highest incidence rates are in young girls. These girls have very high HIV incidence as they grow up, and when they reach their 30s, they have a very high prevalence. Right? You've already seen the 70%. The overall prevalence in this group is about 60%. So it means 3 out of every 5 women in their 30s have HIV. These women are the source of HIV in men in their 30s. There's almost no age difference between these two, right? It's just 1 year age difference. So these women are the source of HIV. These men have just become infected. They have very high viral loads. They don't know they have HIV even. Right? 2 out of every 5 of those men is having a liaison with a teenage girl and is spreading HIV to these teenage girls. These teenage girls will then grow up, reach their 30s, infect the next group of men in their 30s, who will infect the next group of teenagers, and we described the cycle of HIV transmission that leads to the kinds of prevalence rates you just saw. Right? Because if people of the same age have sex with each other, you basically saturate the population quickly and you burn out the epidemic. But when you have this age differential, you create this never-ending population of young girls coming in to become infected. These results, even before we published them, they were published in Lancet HIV on World AIDS Day in 2016. UNAIDS released its 2016 report based on that. They called it the life cycle approach to HIV, basically showing how men and women at different ages have different needs, prevention needs, treatment needs, and so on, as you go through the cycle of life. They copied our diagram, but they made it very simple. Actually, not a color scheme I'm particularly endeared to, but they used our diagram in their report, and basically their report is based on our research. This report has now been used in many countries in Africa, including South Africa. The South African National Plan for HIV has its #1 objective is to break the cycle of transmission, and they stole the UNAIDS diagram. And they called it infection pathway, and they gave it better colors in my view. But our diagram has been seeing all kinds of changes as it's being used across the different countries in Africa. But in essence, it's about how to stop HIV in young girls. In 2017, this was a kicker for us, because this just blew our minds in terms of when we saw these data. So new omic technology that we had access to, we studied the vagina, the vaginal swabs from the women in the tenofovir gel trial. And using proteomics, we were able to characterize the microbiome. And what we showed is that women who have a healthy vagina that was lactobacillus dominant, they have a much higher efficacy of tenofovir gel in preventing HIV. In women who had a greater diversity and a dominance of Gardnerella vaginalis, they had no benefit from tenofovir gel. We then showed in a test tube that Gardnerella has an enzyme that breaks down tenofovir. And within 4 hours, half of all the tenofovir is destroyed. And it breaks tenofovir down into adenine. Now, you know, in a cell, tenofovir competes with adenine. So not only does it reduce the amount of tenofovir, it increases its competitor. And so we now have a much clearer understanding that actually your microbiome defines whether you're going to get protected from HIV or not. In 2018, again, with the tenofovir gel trial data, we showed in this paper in Nature Medicine about how the vaginal milieu is critical. So we moved from a technology to understanding why this technology is not working well, and understanding how we can do better and what is actually going on at a cellular level in the genital tract. And in doing that, trying to grasp how to deal with this problem. And we showed that the increased cytokines was increasing the CD4 cells. And these CD4 cells in the vagina were being activated. They were expressing a protein called CCR5, which is a critical co-receptor for HIV. And we showed, unsurprisingly, now in hindsight, that if you do not have genital tract infection, the viruses you get infected with are high infectivity viruses. So these are viruses that are able to overcome the threshold, and they are high infectivity. They will cause infection. If you have genital tract infection, the threshold becomes much less, and now you start getting infected with the low infectivity viruses. So the viruses that are causing infection differ in women who have genital inflammation versus those who don't have genital inflammation. Now, I've just spent the last 35 minutes or so telling you 30 years of research. You could have read all of this in the Wall Street Journal. They published an article about our research and the journey I just walked you through in March of this year. So let me end off with where to next. So we're doing two things right now. We've come to the understanding that oral PrEP is very much a niche product. Only a small proportion of people can use it, have the ability to use it, feel at risk, have the ability to adhere to a daily tablet for people who are otherwise well. So we've got to move to technologies that make it easier for women to use protection. And so we're developing these two technologies. I'll walk you through them very quickly. So the first is we're developing together with an organization in Los Angeles, Oakcrest, and with Gilead. I'm just coming from San Francisco yesterday in meetings with Gilead. We're taking Gilead's new, more potent form of tenofovir. It's a tenofovir prodrug called TAF. And TAF is about 50 to 60 times more potent than tenofovir. So all we need is small quantities of TAF. So using Implanon technology, just the contraceptive technology, right, which the Pop Council develops really well, we've used that technology and that platform. We've made some modifications, and we've put TAF into this implant. We've put enough TAF into the implant, which was a challenge by itself, to last a year. Right? In lasting a year, the idea is that we could pretty much, if this works, just think about it, go to all the schools in the high-burden districts, and every girl, we offer them the implant. And then they don't have to worry about HIV for the whole year. And we just do this once a year. That's the plan. Whether it works, we don't know. Right? So that's when we will start. We've just signed agreements with the company that's manufacturing our first batch of TAF implants. We'll put them into women for safety and PK in January of next year. So in about 2023, I should be able to give you the answer. Does it work or not? And if it does, well, there you are. We've got a new technology making it easier for women to use the original thing that we used right at the beginning, tenofovir, because TAF just becomes tenofovir anyway in bloodstream. And then we're developing Caprisa 256. So Caprisa 256, because her antibody has such high potency, and because it does so well in killing clade C viruses, clade C is the dominant clade in Africa, we have to develop this. So the first thing we did is we made, in our lab, we made just 3 grams of the tenofovir, of the Caprisa 256 antibodies. We sent it to Dan Baruch, our colleague at Harvard, and we asked Dan if he would do an animal study. So he did this study with 21 monkeys. The 9 monkeys that got the sham injection all became infected with HIV. This is a monkey form of HIV. The 12 monkeys that received Caprisa 256 did not become infected. In fact, to date, we haven't been able to infect a monkey that's got our antibody. And even when we give incredibly low doses, then went down to doses as low as 0.08 milligrams per kilogram, which is a very small amount of antibody to give, we still don't see breakthrough infections with HIV. So the next step, once we saw this, went to meet with Dr. Fauci, presented the data to him. He agreed the NIH will pick up the tab. So the NIH is manufacturing our antibody. Quraish and I just went to visit the laboratories in Virginia that are making the antibodies. We will inject the first women with our antibody in about May next year. That's the plan. And our idea is to use a combination of two antibodies, VRC07 plus Caprisa 256. This combination provides the best coverage and the best potency against HIV. Again, same idea. Can we inject young girls once every 6 months with these antibodies to protect them against HIV? That's the basic idea. What are we doing now? Well, the reason Quraish is not here to share this presentation with me, she's with UNAIDS in Geneva, in Switzerland at the moment, because we've been trying to tackle this challenge of complacency. I mean, we have just seen systematically how the world is becoming complacent about HIV. And so we published this editorial in Science in June this year, in which we talk about the AIDS response has become a victim of its own successes, and that the impression is that the epidemic is no longer important or urgent. The commitment to HIV is slowly dissipating as the world's attention shifts to Ebola and other things, and complacency is setting in. But as I showed you, 5,000 new infections every day, that just defies any claim that the epidemic has been conquered. And so there's no room for complacency, and that's what we are busy tackling right now. And we've been trying to convey this message to many of our key partners and to people who are important in the fight against HIV. And all of this research that I presented would not be possible were it not for the amazing people we work with and many of the partners we work with. But I want to pay special tribute to our Columbia University family that started us on this road 30-odd years ago, actually 32 years ago. And many of you are too young to recognize some of the people. So I'll tell you who they are in the picture on the right-hand side. So you know who this is, right? I don't need to tell you who this is in this picture. And this is Mervyn and Zena when they came to South Africa as part of the Fogarty training program. Okay, when you can figure out on the top, right at the far end. So this was a meeting we had with our colleagues from Columbia University to build a relationship between the Nelson Mandela School of Medicine and Columbia University. So Zena and Mervyn and ourselves, we're on the other side of this meeting. But that's Dean Rosenfield right at the top. You can recognize him now. And next to Jerry Friedland, there's a woman poking a nose through there. Can you see who that is? That's Wafa. We owe a big debt of gratitude to all of our colleagues at Columbia University who started us on the path to HIV. And 32 years later, we owe them much of all of the fun, the tears, the hard times, the good times, the easy times. And ultimately, that I think we all note that the job's not done yet. We've still got a ways to go. We've got to find a technology that women really will be easily able to use and adhere to in order to protect them from getting HIV. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Wonderful, wonderful overview. And I was thinking how important it is to stick with it when you said first the kind of things which didn't work out, but just the kind of tenacity to stick with it. Any questions?
Okay.
I actually have to leave. I'm sorry I have to get on the phone call, but I wanted to thank Salim. I remember meeting Salim when he was first doing research just want to ask you one thing. Looking at the prevalence data you showed in women as they aged, many years ago, Croatia gave a talk. Actually, it was the old auditorium, and you'd already been working in Slavica for a long time, and there was that graph that went like that. And I somewhat kind of, with heavy heart, said, if you had done nothing in terms of prevention, could that graph have looked worse? And it's the same, I understand the front of the work you're doing, but it sounds like you're not the only game in town. People are trying to do prevention, they're trying to intervene, and you look at those data on prevalence, and you ask the question, could it have been worse if no one had done any, we wouldn't have known how bad it was. But those are data of kind of failure in prevention. And I just wonder if that's a correct observation.
Yeah. No, and it reflects our failure, actually, that we have not been able to have a bigger impact, because this is not for a lack of trying. I mean, we have a huge infrastructure, a huge amount of activity trying to prevent HIV. We have mobiles going to all the schools. I mean, it's a huge effort on our part. But forget us. Because this is the highest burden district in South Africa, you can imagine PEPFAR, Global Fund, it's all their number one target. In fact, if two cars meet an accident in this district, they're very likely to be two PEPFAR cars. So you get some idea that we've got big NGOs trying to deal with this problem in the same district. And I told Debbie that it's a waste of time, because they're not having any. If they're having any impact, I'm not seeing it. Right? You cannot get to 70% prevalence in 30-year-old women and say I'm having an impact. Actually, that's just nonsensical. And I said to her, the reason is very simple. You're not dealing with the problem. So here's the problem. Your problem is being driven by high rates of HIV in young women from having sex with men in their 30s. These are not sugar daddies as in the traditional sense, like men in their 50s and so on. These are men about 7, 8 years, up to 10 years older. And if you don't have an intervention that deals with that problem, you can do what you like. Right? Basically, you're treating the people who are not doing the transmission. That's what it tells me. Right? Because we have pretty reasonable 90 figures. Right? If you look at the UNAIDS targets, we're at about 60, 62, and about 88. So we're not that bad, but we're seeing no impact.
Excellent presentation.
Thanks, Ron. I'll see you later.
These differences, you showed that the sex difference is throughout sub-Saharan Africa. I don't think there are really comparable data in Europe or US. Is this a socio-cultural difference, or is it a biological difference?
That's a good question, because I asked somebody last week at the meeting I was at the academy about the south of the U.S., where there are larger numbers of young women who are getting HIV. I said, do we know in the U.S. what the age difference is? Or are they just getting HIV from young boys? You see, in South Africa and much of Africa, you can't get HIV from young boys because they don't have HIV. So young girls sleeping with young boys makes little difference. In fact, the problem with that is the boys will get it from the girls. But the girls are not getting it from those boys because those boys don't have HIV or very little HIV. So
they're getting it from sleeping with older men.
Yeah. They can only get it from sleeping with older men. So I don't know whether that applies in Australia or anywhere else, because remember, all those epidemics are so dominated by IDUs and by MSM that we don't have comparable data from those settings. But I think you would be able to get comparable data from the South, because there are sufficient numbers of young women, black young women getting it. Because young gay black men are clearly a problem in terms of high incidence rates that they have in the South. And women are getting it as well. So I don't know the answer to your question, actually. Yeah.
So Salim, thanks so much. It was just wonderful to hear all that history and to hear you persevering through all that failure, which is tough. So, I worked with the Rakai folks, and they've also had dozens of years of failure, and now we're seeing some success. And so I'm trying to put together their successes with yours.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like there was some talk at the COI meetings about the confluence of, vaginal inflammation and that whole story, but also with circumcision.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't go down. And of course, the latest data from Rakai suggests that some combination
Mm-hmm.
of treatment, high levels of treatment, and pretty good levels of male medical circumcision. So there's clearly some underlying factors that seem to be your success and that success. Do you want to? Can you bring those together?
Yeah, I mean, Rakai is fascinating. I've chatted to Tom Quinn at length about their data. So their latest paper in the NEJM, which I've spent many hours perusing and reviewed it, of course, it's intriguing because, you see, if you didn't do anything, you would expect HIV to go down. Right? Because that's happening everywhere, regardless of what you do. HIV, like any other epidemic, it's all going down. And it's most clearly seen in the latest data that the SEARCH trial presented. So the SEARCH trial, Diane Havler's trial, massive study. I mean, the biggest study I've ever seen. And she shows zero difference between the intervention and control arm. But she shows a 30% reduction in HIV incidence in both arms over time. So just over time, it's going down. So I wondered in Rakai how much of that is just natural decline and how much of that is actual intervention. Because, of course, their paper has no control group. It's just time series. And when I look at the general trends in the decline of HIV incidence, we don't see it going down as fast as what we saw in Rakai. So I think that is a combination of the massive circumcision program together with treatment rollout, and Uganda went early with treatment rollout, and together with everything else they've been doing with STDs and so on. So I think they are right, that it's some combination of that. But I think they give all of that too much credit, because I think a large amount of that decline is occurring anyway.
I'm looking at the non-fellows, because the fellows have, have a special meeting after this, which is,
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I have two brief questions. You mentioned that stigma is such a barrier to treatment and prevention. I would love to hear some of the targeted approaches to stigma reduction that are being taken place. And then you talked about the role of traditional healers. Can you comment on, generally, have they been partners or barriers in trying to get prevention efforts out?
Okay, so let me answer your first question. I'll come back to the traditional healers. I'm blanking on what your first question was now.
About stigma.
Stigma.
Any culturally targeted approaches
Yeah.
to stigma reduction?
So I don't think we've had particular success in that area due to anything we've done. When I think back, the biggest thing that happened that broke stigma in our community, much of the research I presented is in one area called Vulindlela, where we did our research. When we first went there in 2001, at the request of the local chief, he asked us to meet with him on a Saturday morning because that's when the council meets. And when we got there, they told us to sit outside and wait in the hot sun, which I said, you mean you invited me and you're making me sit outside in the sun? Okay. I waited, and we waited for about an hour and a half, and then they invited us in. When they invited us in, they said, we only have a few minutes to meet with you. So we came all the way from Durban. It's an hour and a half drive just to get here. And then he explained, they've got 3 funerals of young girls that they have to go to. And, that's all he had to tell me. And I knew we were going to do work here. Because for that chief and his whole, to prioritize going to those funerals over meeting with a bunch of academics is what I think is what commitment to your community really is. And so that's why we did that work. And one of the first things we did in that community is, which was actually done by the First Lady, the Premier's wife, was in medical school with me, and we recruited her. She's just brilliant, and she did the first study in that community. We simply went to every household that had a funeral in the last month, and she asked about the cause of death, and she asked about what their perceptions were of that death. And these were young girls. Young girls got no business dying like this. And we learned nobody is dying of HIV. Nobody. They don't even talk about it. They don't even deal with it. And so this was a disease, and the stigma actually follows you to the grave. That's what we saw. And nobody had HIV in this community.
Total denial.
Total. Zero. We looked high and low. But when we started providing ART in 2003, they were bringing patients to us in the wheelbarrows. That's how sick. Death's door. And we were treating them. And, we were treating them with pretty bad drugs, including D4T. But they were recovering and walking to the clinic at the next visit. And one of the things we did very early on is we hired about 27 local people who had HIV and who were on treatment. And we asked them just to be ambassadors. And I think that did more than anything else. It's the equivalent of your Rock Hudson, Magic Johnson situation in the US. It gave it a face. It became legitimate to say, I have HIV. It didn't solve our basic problem, though, which is that the moment a girl says she has HIV, the family kicks them out of the house or ostracizes them, doesn't want them to eat in the same table. We've had all of that. And we just worked through that in the early years. I don't think we see any of that anymore. We just don't see any of it. It's all gone. Because there are more people with HIV than without HIV, actually. So it's just the tables are turned. The HIV is so widespread.
Is much less.
Yeah, and we have all these huge testing programs. So, the first 90 for us is still a problem because about 2 out of every 5 people don't know they have HIV yet. But the 3 out of 5 is a lot of people know they have HIV. So if you announce in a household you have HIV, there's already a few others in the household that have HIV. So that pretty much, HIV is pretty normative today. And I don't think it was anything we did. I wish it was, but it wasn't, I don't think. I think it was simply just the prevalence and the fact that these ambassadors came out there, legitimized it, enabled others to come out. On your second question, remind me, you asked traditional healers. Yeah, I'll give you the short answer because the long answer is complicated. We wrote a 150-page report on it. But initially, traditional healers saw this as a business opportunity. They are basically private providers. Right? They are funded out of pocket. And with traditional healers, you don't pay up front. You know, it's not when you go to a doctor, the doctor charges you, bills you for the care that you got. In traditional healers, it doesn't work like that. There's no upfront charging. Well, it's been coming in now, but basically there's no upfront charging. So you go to the traditional healer, it tries to, and traditional healer is not trying to cure you. Traditional healers don't do that. They're trying to find the source of your problem. And usually it's you got some bad spirit, or somebody's got it in for you, or they're trying to establish the source of the problem. And so you have to make 2 or 3 visits, and then once you are cured, once you are better, you have to pay. So you pay when you're cured. And they initially saw it as a way of large numbers of patients coming to see them, mainly with TB, by the way. And they would refer patients for TB. They're good about that because they know they can't fix TB. But patients with TB, once on treatment, actually do quite well. And so those patients are all cured, and they have to now pay their dues. So it became a private transaction. But with time, HIV was not leading to cure. So patients were not paying now because you're not getting better. So it changed. And today, it's not seen, and for the last 10, 15 years, has not been seen as an opportunity to make money. And traditional healers have been very much part and parcel of the programs, not just in condom promotion, but in a whole range of things, including referrals and so on.
We have to stop here, but we want to thank Slim for a fabulous
Hi, Phil. All right, I'm going to students. Okay, let me take this out.
I come to get you for lunch.
Okay, great,
Yes.
Terrific.
And you are, where are you now? 3:57. Okay. So I will come at 12:20. We have about 6, 7 minutes.
Oh, okay, great, terrific. Oh. Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, sure.
So with your tab, do you worry about monoresistance coming up? Or is the only one that's going to be in the implant?
But we have found that